A beggar pleads to pay later in the supermarket line. What the millionaire did next surprised everyone. On a busy Monday morning, in the checkout line of a supermarket on the Upper East Side of New York City, Martha Wilson anxiously waited with only a loaf of bread and a quart of milk in her trembling hands. Her face, marked by time and weather, revealed the weariness of someone who struggled daily for survival. When her turn came, she looked at the cashier with pleading eyes. "Sir, could I possibly take just this bread and milk? I promise I'll come back next week to pay. It's just that my Social Security check hasn't arrived yet." The embarrassed cashier glanced at the line forming behind her. Hurried executives checked expensive watches. Elegant ladies rolled their eyes. One of them huffed, not bothering to hide her impatience. At that moment, a tall man wearing an impeccably tailored suit approached. "How much is the lady's bill?" asked Richard Morgan, known in the business world as the calculator for his coldness and precision in business dealings. $17.50, the cashier replied. Richard took a $100 bill from his wallet. This should cover the lady's purchases and then some. But before the cashier could say anything, Richard turned to Martha. "Would you accompany me? Let's complete your shopping for the month." The customer's eyes followed this unusual Hussein, the millionaire owner of Morgan Investments, a company that had revolutionized the American financial market, pushing a cart alongside a humble-looking elderly woman, filling it with rice, beans, oil, coffee, and other basic items. "You don't need to do this," Martha murmured, embarrassed. "I know," he replied dryly, continuing to select products. Martha noticed that despite the generosity of the gesture, there was a deep sadness in the man's eyes. As he paid for the groceries, she observed that, unlike the other executives, he wore no wedding ring, wasn't talking on his cell phone, didn't seem to be in a hurry. It was as if he were completely alone, even while surrounded by so many people. As they said goodbye at the supermarket exit, she took from her worn bag a small wooden sculpture representing two intertwined hands. "Please, accept this. It's not much, but it was made with care." Richard looked at the object curiously. "Did you make this?" "Yes, I work with woodcraft. It's my passion, even when it doesn't provide a living." He accepted the gift with a stiff nod, placed it in his pocket, and left for his office in the financial district, where he would spend another day analyzing spreadsheets, closing deals, and making decisions that would affect hundreds of lives, all without showing any emotion. That night in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Richard poured himself an expensive whiskey and contemplated the small wooden sculpture. "To remember that no one is truly alone," Martha had said. Ironic, he thought, because solitude was precisely what he knew best. Raised in an orphanage after being abandoned by his parents, Richard had learned early on to count only on himself. Graduating with honors in mathematics, he transformed his ability with numbers into an empire. At 45, he had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, but no one to share it with. His routine was meticulously planned, with no room for unforeseen events. That's why not even he understood the impulse that led him to help that woman. In the following days, he tried to return to his routine, but the image of that woman and her dignity in the face of difficulties kept returning to his mind. 2 weeks later, walking through Washington Square Park, he saw her. Martha had set up a small stall where she sold her wooden sculptures. What caught his attention wasn't just the beauty of the pieces, but the group of children around her, watching fascinated as she taught them carving techniques. This is the secret, children. In wood, as in life, we need to respect the natural grain, work with it, not against it. Richard observed from a distance, impressed by how this simple woman captivated the children's attention. She conveyed a wisdom that didn't come from books or degrees, but from life. "Mr. Richard," she exclaimed when she noticed him, "what a nice surprise. Come meet my little open-air workshop." The children looked curiously at the serious man, so different from the park's regular visitors. Richard approached awkwardly, unaccustomed to interactions that weren't strictly professional. "Children, this is the gentleman I told you about, who helped me at the supermarket," Martha explained. Girl of about 10 looked at Richard with wide eyes. "So you're like a superhero then? For the first time in many years, Richard felt the corner of his mouth rise in a slight smile. No, I'm nothing like that. Everyone can be a hero when they help someone, Martha philosophized, returning to her carving. Work. You just need to be alert to the opportunities. Richard observed the artisan's calloused hands shaping raw wood into something beautiful. There was something hypnotic about the process, something that he, always so hurried, rarely allowed himself to appreciate, the value of time, patience, process. The wind began to blow stronger, announcing one of those summer storms so common in New York. The children dispersed, and Martha began to hastily collect her material. Let me help. Sayosati offered Richard, helping to store the pieces in a worn cardboard box. Thank you. I need to protect everything. This is my livelihood. Do you have a suitable place to store your pieces? I have a small room in the back of my friend's house in Harlem. It's not ideal, but it works. At that moment, the sky opened up. The heavy rain caught them by surprise, soaking the sculptures that hadn't yet been stored. Richard took off his jacket and covered the pieces, leading Martha under the awning of a nearby shop. My workshop will flood with this rain, she lamented. It always happens when it rains this hard. Richard observed the genuine concern on the woman's face. It wasn't just about the material value of the pieces, but their meaning. Those sculptures were extensions of herself, of her art, of her soul. Without thinking twice, Richard did something completely out of character for his controlled self. He offered help. I have an empty space on the ground floor of one of my commercial buildings in Tribeca. You could use it as a workshop. Martha's eyes widened in surprise. But that must cost a fortune. It's been empty for months. Better to be useful to someone. The artisan studied the face of this enigmatic man. Behind the cold, calculating facade, she could see something that perhaps even he didn't realize, a deep need for human connection. I accept, on one condition, that you let me pay with art classes for underprivileged children from the community. That's how the project was born that, without either of them knowing at that moment, would forever change not only their lives, but that of an entire community. The space provided by Richard was spacious, well lit, and had a privileged location. In no time, Martha transformed the cold, empty environment into a welcoming community workshop. The white walls gained vibrant colors, shelves were installed to display the sculptures, and work tables were strategically distributed to accommodate students. Richard, initially distant, began to visit the place with increasing frequency, using the excuse of checking on the property. In truth, something about that environment attracted him. The genuine simplicity, the unfettered creativity, the disinterested generosity. You should try it, Martha suggested one afternoon, offering him a piece of wood and a carving tool. I don't have talent for this. Nobody is born knowing. Art isn't in the hands, it's in the eyes and heart. Reluctantly, Richard accepted the challenge. His hands, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts and sliding over computer keyboards, now struggled to tame the wood. The frustration was visible on his face. Do you see this knot in the wood? Martha pointed out. Many would see it as a defect, an obstacle. But for a good craftsman, it's an opportunity to create something unique. Life's challenges are like that. They can defeat us or make us more interesting. Those simple words hit Richard in a way that no advice from his expensive therapists had managed to. For the first time, he began to question whether his obsession with control and perfection wasn't actually impoverishing his existence. The community workshop quickly gained fame in the neighborhood. Children from Harlem came down to have free art classes. Elderly people from the community found a space for socialization. Tourists stopped by to admire and buy exclusive pieces. During one of the classes, Brittany, Richard's niece and only close relative, appeared without warning. She was a 32-year-old woman, spoiled and always waiting for her uncle's inheritance. Her look of disapproval upon seeing Richard among humble children, with his sleeves rolled up, working on a sculpture, didn't go unnoticed. Uncle Richard, what? Does this mean the powerful president of Morgan Investments playing artisan? Richard felt the familiar embarrassment he always experienced around his niece. Since he had assumed her guardianship after his sister's death, he had never known how to deal with her. "Brittany, this is Martha, the artist who coordinates this project." The look Brittany gave the elderly woman mixed disdain and suspicion. "Charmed," she said with evident falseness. "Uncle, we need to talk in private." In a secluded corner, Brittany made no effort to hide her indignation. "Have you lost your mind? This old woman is clearly manipulating you. She's probably already eyeing your fortune. Martha refused money when I offered, yet she only accepted this space on the condition of turning it into a social project. Please, it's an obvious strategy. First, she refuses money to appear disinterested. Then she gets closer and closer. You're being naive." Brittany's words planted a seed of doubt in Richard. After all, it wouldn't be the first time someone approached him out of interest. As a successful businessman, he had identified hundreds of opportunists. Could Martha be just another one, using more sophisticated methods? In the following days, Richard reduced his visits to the workshop, maintaining a cautious distance. He observed Martha from afar, analyzing every gesture, every word, looking for signs of falsehood. To his surprise, even in his absence, she continued the work with the same enthusiasm and dedication. What he didn't know was that Brittany had hired a private investigator to discover the artisan's past. She was determined to find something that would compromise this woman, who in her view threatened her inheritance. On a rainy afternoon, Richard received Brittany in his office. She arrived with a thick envelope, a triumphant smile on her face. "I have something you need to see, Uncle." Inside the envelope were documents, old photos, and newspaper clippings. Brittany spread them across the desk with the air of someone who had just solved a great mystery. "Do you know who your dear Martha is? A former university professor of arts at NYU. She's not a simple artisan, as she presents herself." Richard examined the documents with growing interest. The photos showed a younger Martha, elegant, receiving awards, giving lectures, surrounded by influential people from the artistic milieu. She was married to Augustus Wilson, a major investor who went bankrupt after a financial scandal 20 years ago. They lost everything. Her husband abandoned her, fleeing abroad with another woman, leaving her to face creditors and public humiliation. As he read the documents, Richard felt a strange mixture of relief and fascination. Far from being a scammer, Martha had been a successful woman who faced a devastating turn in her life. "There's more," continued Brittany, showing a newspaper clipping. "She has a son, Edward Wilson, who lives in Europe. They severed ties after the scandal. He blamed his mother for not preventing his father's actions." Richard looked up from the documents, a new understanding forming in his mind. This simple woman who taught children with such dedication carried a story of loss and resilience much deeper than he had imagined. She never mentioned any of this. Of course not. She's building an image of a humble and generous old lady. Richard stood up and walked to the window, observing the city below. Or perhaps she's just rebuilding her life with dignity, without using the past as a crutch or excuse. Brittany's expression hardened. "You're being naive, Uncle. People like us need to always be vigilant. Everyone wants something from us." For the first time, Richard clearly saw what money had done to his niece and to himself. The constant suspicion, the inability to see, generosity without ulterior motives, the loneliness disguised as self-preservation. "Thank you for the information, Brittany. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important meeting." As soon as his niece left, Richard picked up the phone. It was time to meet the real Martha Wilson. The chamomile tea steamed in the simple cup as Martha observed Richard with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. The workshop was empty at that hour. It was already past 8 in the evening, and the children had returned to their homes in Harlem. "So you already know," she said simply, without beating around the bush. "I imagined you would find out sooner or later." Richard nodded, holding his own cup, smelling the calming aroma of the herb. "Why didn't you tell me?" Martha looked out the window, where the city lights began to dot the New York night. What would be the point? That Martha Wilson that doesn't exist anymore. University professor, art curator, wife of a powerful man, all that is long gone. But your training, your knowledge, all that remains." She smiled with a mixture of nostalgia and acceptance. "Yes, and I use it every day here. I teach what I know to those who need it, without a diploma hanging on the wall or status to intimidate." Richard then realized the true meaning of what she had told him during their first meeting about the sculpture of intertwined hands, to remember that no one is truly alone. She understood loneliness not as someone observing it from the outside, but as someone who had experienced it deeply. "Does your son know where you are, how you live?" A glimpse of pain crossed the artist's eyes. "Edward cut ties with me when we lost everything. He was starting his career in Europe when the scandal broke." His father's tarnished name, the evaporated fortune, it was too much for a young man in his early 20s. "And your ex-husband?" "Augustus died 5 years ago in Switzerland. I never saw him again after he left me behind with the debts and public shame." She paused, looking at her wrinkled hands. "I hold no grudge. He was also a victim of his own ambitions and weaknesses." Richard felt a growing admiration for this woman. Where he had responded to his childhood of abandonment by building walls and accumulating wealth as a shield, she had found a path of simplicity and generosity even after losing everything. "Why did you accept my help at the supermarket? You could have had too much pride for that." Martha smiled. "Pride, I used to have plenty of that. Today I know that accepting help when we need it is as important as offering it when we can. One keeps the other in balance." At that moment, Richard's cell phone rang. It was his secretary, informing him that the storm battering the city had knocked down a century-old tree onto the back wall of one of his properties in Greenwich Village. "That's where we store the materials and sculptures that don't fit here in the workshop," Martha explained upon hearing the news. "My God, all our stock for next month's craft fair." Without hesitation, Richard stood up. "Let's go there." The scene they found was desolate. The huge maple tree had collapsed onto the small storage shed, destroying the roof and allowing the torrential rain to soak hundreds of craft pieces. Residents from the community were already mobilizing to try to save whatever possible. Martha walked among the debris, collecting fragments of sculptures with the delicacy of someone handling fragile memories. There were no tears in her eyes, only a silent determination. All the work of the last 4 months, Richard observed this woman who, even in the face of another significant loss, maintained her intact dignity. That's when an idea began to form in his mind. That property in Greenwich Village, where he kept only an underutilized storage space, could serve a much greater purpose. "Martha," he called, the rain still falling on both of them. "What if we transformed this place into something bigger than a simple workshop, a real cultural center for the community?" The artist's eyes lit up, despite the circumstances. "A cultural center? Here?" "This property is strategically located between downtown and uptown. It could be a bridge, a meeting space between realities that normally don't mix." For the first time since he had met her, Richard saw tears in Martha's eyes. Not of sadness for the material loss, but of emotion for the possibility that was opening up. "I've always dreamed of something like this, but never." "Then let's make this dream come true," interrupted Richard, feeling an excitement he hadn't experienced in a long time. "We'll rebuild everything, bigger and better." The following week, as workers began to clear the site for the construction of the future Intertwined Hands Cultural Center, a name suggested by Martha in reference to the small sculpture she had given Richard, an unexpected discovery was made. During the removal of the debris from the old storage shed, the workers found a metal box buried under the concrete floor. Inside it, documents yellowed by time revealed that the property had housed, decades earlier, an orphanage maintained by a religious order. When Richard was called to see the discovery, he felt a strange premonition. Something about that name, Our Lady of Grace Home, sounded painfully familiar. With slightly trembling hands, he examined the documents, lists of children taken in, old photographs, activity reports. And then, in one of the lists dated 1980, a name jumped out at him. Richard Smith, 5 years old, admitted on 3/12/1980. The world seemed to stop for a moment. It was him. That orphan, abandoned by his parents, was himself. The orphanage where he grew up, which remained in his memories as a cold and impersonal place, was right there, on that property that now belonged to him. "Sir, is everything all right?" asked one of the workers, noticing the paleness that had taken over the businessman's face. Richard nodded mechanically, putting the documents back in the box. He needed to process that information away from curious eyes. He needed to understand what that coincidence, if it was just a coincidence, meant. In his penthouse that night, Richard spread the documents on the dining table that had never received guests. He examined each photo, each list, looking for more connections to his past. That's when he found, among the activity reports, mentions of a volunteer program that brought university students to teach the children. And there it was. On the volunteer list from 1985, Martha Johnson, NYU School of Fine Arts, art teacher. The shock was even greater than the first. Martha had been a volunteer at the orphanage exactly at the time when he had been there as a child. Had they met? Had she been his teacher? Why had she never mentioned this? With these questions hammering in his mind, Richard barely managed to sleep. The next morning, he headed to the workshop as soon as the doors opened. Martha was organizing materials when he entered. Just one look at his face was enough for her to realize that something significant had happened. "You discovered something in the property documents," she stated, not as a question, but as a realization. Richard placed the photos and documents on the table. "You were a volunteer at Our Lady of Grace home between 1985 and 1987. She nodded, a nostalgic smile appearing on her lips. "Those were important years for me. I was starting my academic career and wanted my art to have a social purpose." "Was there?" said Richard, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I was one of the children at the orphanage." Martha's eyes widened. She approached, examining Richard's face as if looking for traces of the boy she had known. My God, Richard Smith, the quiet boy who drew numbers instead of figures. It was as if a door locked for decades suddenly opened. Richard remembered a young teacher who, unlike the severe nuns, smiled a lot and brought colors to Saturday afternoons. She had been the first person to notice his ability with mathematics, not as something strange, but as a special talent. "You gave me a graph paper notebook," Richard remembered, the memory coming vividly after so long. "You said I could create art with numbers and patterns." "Sacred geometry," Martha completed, tears in her eyes. "You created impressive mathematical patterns. I said that one day you could be a great architect or engineer. I became a mathematician and then a financier, and built all this from scratch." She made a gesture encompassing not just the workshop, but symbolizing Richard's entire business empire. "I always knew you would go far, boy." Richard felt something breaking inside him, not in a painful way, but like a dam finally giving way, allowing long repressed waters to flow freely. Memories he had suppressed, emotions he had denied, everything was coming to the surface now. "Why did you never say anything?" "Since the supermarket. At first I didn't recognize you. There were many children over the years. Then when I began to suspect, I wasn't sure. And when I was, well, I thought you needed to make that connection yourself. Some journeys need to be traveled on your own." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Richard Morgan, the man known in the financial market for his calculating coldness, embraced Martha and cried like the lonely child he once was. The news of the transformation of the Greenwich Village property into a cultural center quickly spread through the community. The project, initially modest, grew in ambition and scope. Richard, energized by a new understanding of his own past, devoted more and more time to the initiative, to the astonishment of his associates and employees. The intertwined hands cultural center would be much more than a simple expanded workshop. In the plans developed by architects hired by Richard, there were rooms for various workshops, a small theater, a community library, and a cafe that would serve as a space for socializing and generating income for local residents. Martha, now recognized by her true name and trajectory, Professor Martha Wilson, naturally assumed the role of artistic director of the project. Her academic experience, combined with years of community living, brought a unique vision that balanced artistic excellence and social relevance. Meanwhile, Brittany observed everything with growing apprehension. Her uncle, previously so predictable, in his routine of obsessive work, now hardly appeared at the office. Worse still, rumors circulated about changes to his will. "He's gone completely crazy," she confided to her lawyer. "He's throwing money at this absurd project and, from what I've heard, plans to allocate a significant portion of his assets to this foundation." The lawyer, who had known Richard for decades, seemed less alarmed. "Your uncle has always been meticulous with investments. Perhaps he's just diversifying his portfolio to include social impact projects." "Social impact? He never cared about that. It's clearly manipulation by that old woman. We need to do something." That's how Brittany made a decision that would change the course of the story. Using her own resources and contacts in Europe, she located Edward Wilson, Martha's son, and contacted him. Edward, now 45, was a bitter man who had built a modest career as a gallery owner in London. When he received Brittany's call, his first reaction was distrust. "Why would I be interested in seeing my mother after 20 years? Because she's about to become a very rich woman," Brittany lied. "She's manipulating my uncle, a millionaire, businessman who plans to leave a fortune to her." Those words hit Edward exactly where Brittany intended, in his never-healed wounds, in his resentment over the family's financial collapse, in the never-processed anger against his mother who, in his distorted view, hadn't done enough to prevent the catastrophe. A week later, Edward landed at JFK International Airport. Brittany was waiting for him with an executive car and a well-crafted plan. "My uncle is organizing a launch event for the Cultural Center tomorrow. It will be the perfect time for you to confront your mother and expose her true intentions." What Brittany didn't tell Edward was that she had investigated his past as well. She knew he was facing financial difficulties in England and that his small business was on the verge of bankruptcy. She also knew he had developed a problem with gambling, accumulating considerable debts. In her calculating mind, very similar. To the uncle she so criticized, Brittany saw Edward as a perfectly manipulable piece for her purposes. The day of the official launch of the Intertwined Hands Cultural Center dawned sunny, as if the weather itself conspired for the event's success. The former property, where there was once only a storage shed, and decades earlier an orphanage, now housed a modern yet welcoming construction that harmonized perfectly with the surrounding area. The central courtyard was decorated with colorful pennants in reference to the summer festivals that Richard vaguely remembered from his childhood at the orphanage. Stands with typical foods from New England, Martha's region of origin, spread irresistible aromas throughout the environment. A group of young musicians from the community played jazz, creating the perfect soundtrack for that morning of celebration. Local authorities, business people, artists, community residents, and children from public schools in the area mingled in a rare demonstration of genuine social integration. Richard, wearing not his usual suit, but a more casual white linen shirt, observed everything with a satisfaction he had never experienced upon closing his biggest deals. Martha circulated among the guests with the natural elegance of someone who had once frequented the most sophisticated cultural circles, but also with the warm simplicity that had won the heart of the community. "Are you nervous?" asked Richard, approaching her minutes before the official inauguration ceremony. "A little," she admitted, "but it's a good nervousness, the kind we feel when a dream comes true." It was at that moment that Edward entered the courtyard, accompanied by Brittany. Even after 2 decades, Martha immediately recognized her son. Her face aged 20 years in a second, all joy replaced by an expression of shock and vulnerability that broke Richard's heart. "Edward?" she murmured, her voice almost inaudible in the bustle of the party. The man approached, his face a mask of studied contempt. "Hello, Mother. Surprised to see me?" Martha took a step in his direction, arms instinctively open to embrace the son she hadn't seen in so long. Edward stepped back, maintaining the physical distance that mirrored the emotional abyss between them. "I didn't come for reconciliations," he said coldly. "I came because I heard that you found a new sponsor." He looked at Richard with disdain. "You always knew how to charm influential people, didn't you?" The cruelty of those words hit Martha like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, and Richard supported her by the arm. "I think there's a big misunderstanding," intervened Richard, his voice calm but firm. "Your mother didn't ask me for anything. In fact, she was reluctant to accept my help from the beginning." Edward laughed humorlessly. "Of course, the perfect technique. My father fell for it too at first. The idealistic art professor, above material interests, until she slowly began to influence all his decisions, leading him to ruin." Martha paled even more. "You still believe that? After so long? Your father made his own decisions, Edward. Decisions I begged him not to make." "Lies," he exclaimed, attracting the attention of nearby guests. "You were always complicit, and now you're doing the same with this man." Richard noticed Brittany's satisfied look, observing from a distance the scene she had orchestrated. Everything became clear to him. His niece had brought Edward with the sole purpose of sabotaging the project and driving him away from Martha. "Mr. Wilson," said Richard, maintaining his composure, "I don't know what you were told to bring you here, but I suggest we talk in private. This is an important moment for many people who worked hard to make this project happen." Edward looked around, noticing for the first time the disapproving looks he was receiving, especially from the children and young people from the community, for whom Martha was an almost maternal figure. "I have nothing to discuss. I came only to warn you about who this woman really is." "I know exactly who she is," replied Richard with quiet conviction. "She was my art teacher when I was an orphaned boy, right here on this property where the Our Lady of Grace home operated. She was the first person to believe in me, and now, by an extraordinary coincidence of fate, our paths have crossed again." Edward blinked, confused. This was not the narrative Brittany had presented to him. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother changed the lives of many children as a volunteer at that orphanage, Mr. Wilson. I was one of them. This cultural center is my way of giving. Back not just to her, but to all children who, like me, need someone to believe in their potential." Martha, regaining some of her composure, looked into her son's eyes. "Edward, I don't know what they told you to bring you here, but I'm happy to see you after so long. I've missed you every day of these 20 years. The sincerity of those simple words finally seemed to penetrate the armor of resentment that Edward had built. He looked around again, observing the cultural center, the children, the community gathered. It was undeniable that this didn't resemble at all a scheme to enrich oneself at the expense of a naive man. "I need some time," he finally said, moving away towards the exit. Richard discreetly signaled to one of his employees to follow Edward and ensure that he didn't leave New York immediately. There was much to be clarified, and he suspected that Brittany had used Martha's son in a merciless way, exploiting deep emotional wounds for her own selfish ends. Despite the tense moment, the inauguration ceremony continued. However, to those who knew Martha, it was evident that her smile didn't reach her eyes. The reunion with her son, instead of being the moment of joy she had always dreamed of, had turned into another source of pain. At the end of the event, when most of the guests had already left, Richard found Martha sitting alone on a bench in the garden, contemplating the sunset that tinged the New York sky with orange hues. "Has he left?" she asked without taking her eyes off the horizon. "No, he's staying at a hotel downtown. I asked my assistant to make sure he remains in the city for a few days." She nodded, grateful. "Thank you. Even if he doesn't want to see me again, I at least need to try to understand what happened to him all these years." Richard sat down beside her. "My niece brought him here, Martha. She's worried about my will, about the idea that I'm allocating part of my fortune to this project." "And are you?" "Yes, not just for the cultural center, but for a foundation that will ensure its continuity and expansion to other communities." Martha sighed. Then she was right to fear. In a way. But what Brittany doesn't understand is that this doesn't diminish what I'll leave to her. In fact, involving her in this project would be the best way to ensure she develops values that would help her manage that fortune responsibly. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the sky darken and the first stars appear. "You know, what hurts me the most," Martha finally said, "it's that Edward really believes I had some fault in the collapse of our business. Actually, I was the one who warned Augustus about the risks he was taking, about the illegality of some operations. He didn't listen to me." "Why doesn't your son know that?" "Because I never wanted to further tarnish the image he had of his father. Augustus had already left, abandoned us. What good would it do to completely destroy what remained of the admiration Edward felt for him?" Richard contemplated this extraordinary woman, who even after suffering such losses and injustices, still cared about protecting others' feelings above her own. "Some secrets, when kept for too long, end up becoming poisons," he observed. "Perhaps it's time for Edward to hear the whole truth." The next morning, against all expectations, Edward Wilson returned to the Intertwined Hands Cultural Center. He arrived early, when only a few employees were preparing the space for the day's activities. He found his mother in the small internal workshop, already working on a new sculpture. For a moment, he just stood watching her work, remembering how in his childhood he spent hours fascinated watching those hands transform raw materials into works of art. "Mom," he finally called. Martha looked up, surprised, and moved to see him there. "Edward, you came back. We need to talk about everything." They sat in the center's cafe, still empty at that hour. For hours they unearthed 2 decades of hurts, misunderstandings, and untold truths. Martha finally revealed to her son how she had tried to prevent Augustus from making illegal investments, how she had been threatened by him when she insisted on reporting the irregularities, how she chose to protect the image Edward had of his father, even at the cost of her own reputation. Edward cried as he hadn't since childhood, realizing that for 20 years he had directed his anger at the wrong target. "Brittany told me you were manipulating a rich man, that you had found a new victim," he confessed. "I was so in debt, so desperate, and the resentment never really disappeared. It was easy to believe the worst." That same day, Richard confronted Brittany in his office. Unlike previous discussions, where he allowed his niece to manipulate him emotionally, this time he remained firm. "What you did was cruel and calculated, Brittany. You used the suffering of 2 people to try to protect what you consider yours by right." "Uncle, I was just trying to protect you." "No, you were protecting your inheritance. There's a big difference." The confrontation was painful, but necessary. In the end, Richard presented Brittany with a choice. She could continue as his heir, but with one condition. She would need to actively work in the foundation, learning about social responsibility and the true value of the privilege she possessed. "You have incredible potential, Brittany. Intelligence, determination, strategic vision. Imagine what you could accomplish if you directed those qualities to something greater than your own benefit." To his surprise, after initial resistance, Brittany accepted the challenge. Perhaps out of pragmatism, perhaps from a seed of something better that existed beneath the surface of selfishness, she agreed to take on a role in the Foundation's administration, working directly with Martha. 6 months after the turbulent inauguration, the Intertwined Hands Cultural Center had already become a reference in socio-cultural projects in New York. Edward, who initially planned to stay only a few days, ended up extending his stay in the United States. Using his experience as a gallery owner, he developed a program to connect the community's artisans with international galleries and buyers, creating a sustainable business model that complemented the foundation's funding. Brittany, initially reluctant and distant, gradually discovered an unexplored vocation for managing social projects. Her strategic vision and ability to raise funds brought new perspectives and possibilities for expansion to the initiative. As for Richard, for the first time in his adult life, he felt truly part of something he could call family, not a family defined by blood ties, but by choices, shared values, genuine connections. 1 year after the meeting at the supermarket, the Cultural Center celebrated its first anniversary. The party, more intimate than the inauguration, gathered only the people directly involved in the project: employees, students, community artisans, and of course, the four main responsible for its existence: Richard, Martha, Edward, and Brittany. Under the starry New York sky, seated at a table decorated with the wooden sculptures that had initiated that entire journey, they raised their glasses in a toast. "To the family we find," proposed Richard, "and to the intertwined hands that support us when we need it most." Martha smiled, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "And to encounters that seem like chance, but are perhaps destiny correcting its own mistakes." Edward, now reconciled not only with his mother, but with his own past, added, "To truth, which even when painful, is the only path to healing." And Brittany, surprising everyone with her unusual sincerity, completed, "And to new beginnings which are possible at any age and circumstance." That night, under the New York stars, four people who a year earlier were strangers or adversaries celebrated not just the success of a social project, but the rediscovery of what it really means to be rich, having people with whom to share both the pains and joys of the human journey.